In 1960, Springfield, Massachusetts, was the 72nd largest city in the United States. 72nd. Ahead of Baton Rouge, ahead of Spokane, ahead of Fort Worth. Its armory ran at full capacity. Its gun manufacturer was shipping revolvers to police departments across the country. Its paper mills, its tool shops, its precision parts makers employed tens of thousands of workers in a metropolitan area of roughly 500,000 people. The city had invented basketball, the American automobile, and the mass production technique that Henry Ford would later make famous. It had given the country its dictionary. It had given the world Dr. Seuss. None of that saved it. Today, Springfield is the 174th largest American city. Its population of 154,700 is down from a peak of 174,463. More than 1 in 4 residents lives below the poverty line. Nearly 2 in 5 children do. The casino that opened downtown in 2018, built for $573 million, is now one of the city's largest employers. This is the story of how a city that built the tools of a civilization failed to survive the civilization it built. Chapter 1. The Founding. The Connecticut River runs roughly north to south through the center of western Massachusetts, wide and slow in its lower reaches, cutting through a valley that by the early 17th century was among the most fertile agricultural land in the Northeast. 4 tributaries fed it within a short distance of each other. The soil along its banks was deep and dark, deposited over centuries of flood cycles. The Agawam and Waranaco peoples had farmed it for generations before the first English settlers arrived. They recognized immediately what they had found. So did the settlers. In 1636, a Puritan merchant named William Pynchon led a small party of colonists south from Roxbury and established a trading post on the western bank of the Connecticut River. Pynchon was a shrewd man. He had already made money in the beaver fur trade, and he understood that the real value of the location was not the soil, but the geometry. The settlement sat at the intersection of trade routes running to Boston, Albany, New York, and Montreal. Whoever controlled the crossing controlled the commerce. He named the settlement Agawam Plantation. 5 years later, in 1641, he renamed it Springfield, after his hometown in Essex, England. He had no way of knowing what the name would eventually mean. For the first 4 decades, Springfield was a modest river town. A few hundred settlers, a fur trade, a grist mill, a quiet prosperity built on geography rather than any particular industry. Then, in the summer of 1675, it nearly ceased to exist. King Philip's War, the conflict between English colonial forces and a coalition of native nations led by the Wampanoag Sachem Metacom, swept through the Connecticut River Valley with particular violence. In October of that year, native forces burned Springfield almost to the ground. Roughly 25 of the settlement's 45 homes were destroyed. The settlers rebuilt. The location was too valuable to abandon. That calculation, the location justifies the cost, would repeat itself many times over the following 3 centuries. The town that emerged from those ashes grew quietly through the following century. A market town, a river crossing, a place where goods moved between Boston and the interior. Its population at the time of the first federal census, in 1790, was 1,574 people. Nothing about those numbers suggested what was coming. But in 1777, something had happened that would determine Springfield's trajectory for the next 2 centuries. George Washington needed a place to store weapons. The Continental Army had been fighting for 2 years on supply lines that were fragile, exposed, and perpetually short. Washington wanted an armory, a central depot for the manufacture and storage of military arms, far enough from the coast to be safe from British naval attack, close enough to the population centers of New England to receive men and materials, and positioned on a river that could move supplies north and south. Springfield met every condition. Washington personally selected the site. The first military stores arrived in 1778, stacked in a wooden building on a hill above the river. The hill would later be called Armory Square. Remember that hill? It runs through everything that follows. 9 years after Washington's selection, that hill became the site of one of the most consequential near disasters in American political history. By the winter of 1786, Western Massachusetts was in crisis. The war had ended, but the debts it generated had not. Farmers throughout the region were losing their land to creditors. Courts were issuing judgments faster than men could pay them. A Revolutionary War veteran named Daniel Shays organized an armed uprising. Several thousand indebted farmers who had decided that the government, which had taken their labor in wartime, owed them something in peacetime. On January 25, 1787, Shays led a force of roughly 1,500 men toward the Springfield Armory, intending to seize its weapons and ammunition. General William Shepard, commanding 900 militia loyal to the state government, met them on the road below the arsenal. Shepard fired 2 cannon volleys into the advancing column. 4 men died. The rest scattered into the snow. The rebellion collapsed within weeks. But the shock of it did not. The near seizure of a federal arsenal by American citizens, fewer than 4 years after the Treaty of Paris, demonstrated to the men already discussing constitutional reform in Philadelphia that the Articles of Confederation could not hold the country together. Shays' rebellion did not cause the Constitutional Convention, but it accelerated it. And in a very real sense, the document that governs the United States today carries the fingerprints of a frozen field below a hill in Springfield, Massachusetts. 4 men died in that field. The Constitution was written partly in response to their deaths. That fact appears in almost no history textbook. In 1794, Congress formally established the Springfield Armory as the first federal armory of the United States. That same year, the armory produced its first American military musket. The machines on the hill had begun their work. They would not stop for 174 years. Chapter 2. The Golden Age. In 1819, an inventor named Thomas Blanchard solved a problem that had slowed weapons production at the Springfield Armory for 20 years. The problem was the gun stock. The curved, irregular wooden form that a soldier gripped when he fired. Every stock was slightly different. Every stock had to be shaped by hand, by a skilled craftsman, one at a time. Blanchard conceived a lathe that could trace the contour of an existing form and reproduce it exactly, in wood, at speed, without a craftsman's hands. He spent 3 years refining the machine before it was installed at the armory in 1822. It was not, on its surface, a dramatic invention. It was a lathe, but what it implied was revolutionary. If a machine could trace an irregular form and reproduce it exactly, then every part it produced would be identical to every other part. And if every part was identical, then any part could replace any other part. A broken gun stock from a rifle made in 1820 could be replaced with a gun stock made in 1835. Same dimensions, same fit, same function. The concept had been discussed in theory by Eli Whitney and others before Blanchard, but Springfield was where it was systematically implemented across an entire production process. The armory developed what became known as the American system of manufacturing. Standardized, deindustrialized, interchangeable parts produced by purpose-built machines, assembled by workers who did not need to be master craftsmen. Every modern factory on Earth, from the Ford River Rouge complex to the Toyota production system, traces its operational logic back to that hill above the Connecticut River. The armory did not stop there. It pioneered hourly wages at a time when most American workers were paid by the piece or by the day, with no guarantee of consistency. It developed standardized work processes, written procedures, documented sequences, measurable outputs. It practiced vertical integration decades before the term existed, controlling its own supply chains for wood, metal, and leather. Springfield was not simply making weapons. It was inventing the grammar of modern industrial management, and doing so in a building that most Americans have never heard of. Henry Ford visited the armory, studied its methods, and took notes. The assembly line that would later bear his name owed more to that hill in Springfield than Ford ever publicly acknowledged. By the 1830s, the town around the armory had begun to attract the kind of secondary industry that follows a major employer the way smaller fish follow a larger one. Machine shops opened to supply the armory. Tool makers set up along the river. Skilled mechanics, who had learned their trade on government time, started their own operations in the surrounding streets. The population, which had been under 2,000 at the turn of the century, passed 10,000 by 1840 and kept climbing. The city was, in a very real sense, printing itself into existence one contract at a time. Two brothers named George and Charles Merriam opened a print shop on Federal Street in Springfield in 1831. They were booksellers and publishers, unremarkable in most respects, working in a city that was still primarily known for its armory. 12 years later, in 1843, Noah Webster died in New Haven, Connecticut, leaving behind a dictionary of the American English language. The full edition, first published in 1828, revised and expanded over 4 decades. The most ambitious single-author lexicographic project in the history of the language. Webster's heirs needed a publisher. The Merriam brothers bought the rights. They revised the dictionary, republished it under the name Merriam-Webster, and built a company around it that has operated in Springfield ever since. The headquarters of the American English language has been, for nearly 180 years, a mid-sized city in western Massachusetts. Enter Horace Smith and Daniel Wesson. Smith was a Massachusetts-born gunsmith who had worked at the Springfield Armory and several other New England weapon shops before going into business for himself. Wesson was a mechanic from Worcester with a gift for the internal geometry of firearms. The two men had collaborated before on a lever-action repeating pistol that had not found a market. In 1856, they tried again, founding Smith & Wesson in Springfield with a new design. A small, reliable 7-shot revolver chambered for a self-contained .22 rimfire cartridge, the first of its kind. Produced commercially in the United States, at a time when most revolvers still required loose powder and percussion caps loaded chamber by chamber. They called it the Model 1. By 1860, orders exceeded the factory's production capacity. When the Civil War began the following year, soldiers on both sides bought the revolver privately, a compact, concealable sidearm that loaded faster than anything the Army issued. Smith & Wesson did not need a government contract. The market had already decided. Picture State Street on a Saturday morning in the late autumn of 1890. Start at the corner of Main, where the Massachusetts Mutual Life Insurance Company occupies the ground floor of a building it will soon outgrow. The company was founded in Springfield in 1851, and by 1890 it insures policyholders from Maine to California. Walk west. The street is wide enough for 2 streetcar lines running in opposite directions, and both are running. The air smells of coal smoke and horse, and the particular cold of a New England November morning. On the south side of the street, at number 207, stands the Church of the Unity, a Gothic structure in dark stone, its tower rising above the commercial buildings on either side, designed by a young architect named Henry Hobson Richardson as his first commissioned work in 1866. Richardson went on to redesign American architecture. The church he started with is here, in Springfield, on this street, on this morning. Further west, toward the river, the brick workshops of the Springfield Armory sit on the ridge above the roof lines, visible from almost anywhere in the downtown. A permanent reminder of what organized the city and what the city organized itself around. The population has passed 44,000 and is climbing toward 60,000. The The trains run 12 times a day to Boston, 2 hours east. There are 23 manufacturing establishments within the city limits, producing goods valued at more than $1,000 each. This is a city that knows exactly what it is and exactly where it is going. It did not know how wrong it was. On the afternoon of December 21st, 1891, a 30-year-old Canadian physical education instructor named James Naismith walked into the gymnasium of the International YMCA Training School, later Springfield College, carrying a soccer ball and a pair of peach baskets. His supervisor had given him 2 weeks to invent an indoor winter sport that would keep a restless group of students occupied between the football and baseball seasons. Naismith asked the building's janitor for 2 boxes to use as goals. The janitor had none, but produced 2 half-bushel peach baskets instead. Naismith nailed them to the lower rail of the gymnasium's elevated running track, 10 feet above the floor, wrote out 13 rules on 2 pages of paper, and divided his class of 18 students into 2 teams of 9. The first game was played the same afternoon. One student, William Chase, scored the only basket of the game, a shot from roughly the center of the floor. 4 years later, a Springfield College graduate named William Morgan invented volleyball in neighboring Holyoke. The Connecticut River Valley had, in the space of half a decade, produced 2 of the most widely played sports in human history. Naismith had been given 2 weeks. He used 13 days. On the morning of September 21st, 1893, the date recorded by the Smithsonian Institution, which holds the original vehicle, Frank Duryea drove a gasoline-powered horseless carriage through the streets of Springfield, Massachusetts. The vehicle had been designed by Frank and his brother Charles over the preceding 2 years, built in a rented workshop on Taylor Street, and powered by a single-cylinder engine fed by a spray carburetor that Charles had designed after studying the mechanism of a perfume atomizer. The car broke down partway through the run. A transmission fault. Frank repaired it on the street and drove another half-mile. It was not an elegant demonstration, but it was the first time a gasoline automobile had moved under its own power on an American road. 3 years later, the Duryea Motor Wagon Company sold 13 identical vehicles. The first commercial automobile production in the United States. 13 cars. The whole industry started with 13 cars. A bicycle racer and manufacturer named George Hendy and an engineer named Oscar Hedstrom founded what would become the Indian Motorcycle Company in Springfield. In 1901, the first successful American motorcycle manufacturer, Hendy had been running a bicycle factory on Taylor Street since the late 1890s. Hedstrom was a Swedish-born engineer who built motorized pacing bicycles, gasoline-powered machines used to set the pace for track racing events. The 2 men met at a race in New York, recognized what the other had, and signed a partnership agreement early in 1901. Hedstrom built the first prototype in a rented workshop in Middletown, Connecticut, completing it in May of that year. The first public demonstration was held on Cross Street in Springfield on June 1st, 1901. Within a decade, Indian motorcycles were winning endurance races across the country and exporting to Europe. By 1913, Indian was the largest motorcycle manufacturer in the world, producing 32,000 machines that year alone. In 1921, Rolls-Royce placed its first American manufacturing facility in Springfield, a city of 130,000 people that had, somehow, become a benchmark of precision manufacturing prestige. In 1904, a woman named Henrietta Seuss Geisel gave birth to a son on Howard Street in Springfield. She named him Theodore. His father ran a brewery 2 blocks away, the Hampton Brewing Company, one of the largest in western Massachusetts, until Prohibition shut it down when the boy was 16. Theodore Geisel would later take his mother's maiden name as his pen name, writing and illustrating books under the name Dr. Seuss. His books have sold over 600 million copies in more than 20 languages. The Cat in the Hat, Green Eggs and Ham, How the Grinch Stole Christmas. All of them carry, somewhere in their construction, The eye of a man who grew up watching an industrial city build and unbuild itself, who learned early that the world does not always make the kind of sense adults claim it does. By 1960, the population of Springfield had reached 174,463, the 72nd largest city in the United States. The armory ran at full capacity. Smith & Wesson occupied a sprawling factory complex on Stockbridge Street. The paper mills along the river employed thousands. Merriam-Webster was revising its dictionary for a new generation of readers. Indian Motorcycle had closed in 1953, a casualty of post-war competition and management failures, but the manufacturing base that surrounded it remained largely intact. Keep that in mind, it will not remain intact for long. Chapter 3: Atchit, the Cracks. The prosperity was real. That needs to be said before anything else. In the 1940s and 1950s, Springfield was a working city in the fullest sense of the phrase. A place where a man with a high school education and a willingness to show up on time could find a union job, buy a house, send his children to a public school that functioned, and retire with a pension. The armory employed over 3,000 workers at its wartime peak. Smith & Wesson ran 2 shifts. The paper mills along the Connecticut River employed thousands more. The prosperity was real. It was also not evenly distributed, and the mechanisms by which it was kept uneven were not accidental. They were designed. In the 1940s, the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation produced a series of maps for cities across the United States. The maps divided neighborhoods into 4 categories, color-coded from green to red, rating their suitability for mortgage lending. The criteria included the age and condition of housing stock, the proximity to industrial areas, and, explicitly, in the language of the documents themselves, the racial composition of the neighborhood. Neighborhoods where black residents lived, or where black residents might move, were colored red. Lenders used the maps. Banks used the maps. Real estate agents used the maps. The practice became known as redlining, and in Springfield, as in dozens of other American cities, it operated with quiet mechanical efficiency for 2 decades. Black families who had the income to buy homes in certain neighborhoods could not get mortgages to do so. The wealth that homeownership generates, equity, inheritance, collateral for business loans, was systematically withheld from an entire population. Not through violence, not through explicit law, but through paperwork, through a color on a map. Something else was happening at the same time. Beginning in the 1940s, a wave of Puerto Rican migrants arrived in the Connecticut River Valley, first as seasonal agricultural workers, recruited by labor contractors to pick tobacco in the River Valley fields, then staying, settling, sending for family members, building communities in the neighborhoods of the North End and the South End. By the 1960s, Puerto Rican residents made up a significant and growing share of Springfield's population. Today, that share exceeds 35%, making Springfield home to one of the largest Puerto Rican communities in the northeastern United States. The new arrivals inherited the same structures that had constrained black residents before them. Limited access to credit, concentrated in the neighborhoods the redlining maps had already marked as expendable, enrolled in schools whose funding depended on a property tax base that the redlining maps had deliberately suppressed. The cycle did not need to be reinvented for each new population. It was already running. It had been running for years. And then there was the highway. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the urban renewal programs funded by the federal government arrived in Springfield with the same logic they brought to cities across the country. The logic that the problem with older urban neighborhoods was the neighborhoods themselves, and that the solution was to remove them. Interstate 291 cut through the city's riverfront. Urban renewal projects bulldozed blocks of mixed-use housing and small commercial buildings in the downtown core, replacing them with office plazas and parking structures that generated less tax revenue, employed fewer people, and served the commuting patterns of suburban residents rather than the needs of people who actually lived in the city. The white middle class, meanwhile, was moving to Longmeadow and Wilbraham and East Longmeadow, towns just beyond the city limits, accessible by the new highway system, offering new ranch houses with yards and public schools whose student bodies were, by the mathematics of residential segregation, almost entirely white. They took their property taxes with them. The city watched them go and could do nothing about it. In the summer of 1965, the accumulated pressure found a release point. After police officers beat a black man outside a nightclub on Worthington Street, the North End erupted. The riots lasted several days. Buildings burned. The National Guard was called. The city was forced in the aftermath to begin a process of school desegregation that it had resisted for years, busing students across district lines, redrawing attendance boundaries, attempting to address through the school system an inequality that the school system had not created and could not by itself resolve. The desegregation orders accelerated white flight. Families who had been considering the suburbs made their decisions. The tax base contracted further. The schools desegregated. The neighborhoods did not. By the mid-1960s, Springfield's population was still near its peak, but the structural conditions that had produced that peak were already weakening. The armory on the hill was still running. 3,500 workers, 2 shifts, the smell of machine oil and hot metal drifting down toward the river. But the Department of Defense had been reviewing its armory network for years, consolidating production, evaluating which facilities were essential and which were redundant. The armory had survived previous reviews. It would not survive the next one. In 1968, the Department of Defense closed the Springfield Armory. The announcement came with the bureaucratic flatness that attends most institutional decisions of enormous consequence. A facility review, a consolidation of production capacity, a determination that the armory's functions could be absorbed elsewhere. 174 years of continuous operation ended with a memo. The 3,500 workers were given notice. The machines on the hill went quiet. The buildings remained, the long brick workshops, the commandant's quarters, the arsenal, standing on the ridge above the city exactly as they had stood since the 1840s. Now empty, now surplus federal property, now available for reuse as something other than what they had been built to be. Springfield had lost its anchor. Everything that followed was, in some sense, a consequence of that single fact. Chapter 4. The Collapse. The closing of the Springfield Armory did not destroy the city in a single blow. That is not how deindustrialization works. It works the way water works on limestone, slowly, invisibly, until the structure that looked solid from the outside collapses into itself without warning. The armory had been the gravitational center of Springfield's industrial ecosystem for 174 years. Around it had grown a constellation of secondary manufacturers, precision machine shops, tool and die makers, metalworking suppliers, companies that existed because the armory needed what they made. When the armory closed, the constellation did not immediately disperse, but the gravity was gone. American Bosch, which had operated a major electrical components factory in Springfield since the 1920s, began reducing its workforce in the early 1970s. Danaher Tool closed its Springfield operations. Van Norman Industries, which had manufactured precision grinding machines on Tapley Street since 1908, wound down production over the course of a decade. The pattern repeated itself across the city's industrial base. Not always a single dramatic closure, but a steady attrition of shifts, then departments, then buildings. Then silence. Real wages in the remaining manufacturing jobs declined through the 1970s and into the 1980s as the leverage that union membership had provided eroded. alongside the employment base it depended on. The cost of living did not decline alongside them. It never does. The population registered what the economy was doing. Springfield's census count fell from 174,463 in 1960 to 163,905 in 1970, then to 152,319 in 1980. Each decade's number told the same story in a different way. The people who could leave were leaving, and the people who stayed were, on average, poorer than the people who had left. The tax base shrank. The city's revenue shrank with it. The demands on city services, schools, public safety, social services, did not shrink. They grew because concentrated poverty generates need at a rate that dispersed prosperity never has to address. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, Springfield ran deficit budgets, not occasionally, not in response to a specific crisis, but as a structural condition. Year after year, spending more than it collected, borrowing to cover the difference, deferring maintenance, deferring pension obligations, deferring everything that could be deferred. The city kept its property records on index cards. Payroll was tracked on paper. Budget projections were built on revenue estimates that bore only an approximate relationship to the revenue that actually arrived. For 18 consecutive years, the city of Springfield produced budgets that did not balance. 18 years. The mechanisms that might have caught the problem earlier, rigorous auditing, independent financial oversight, a functioning relationship between the city and the bond markets, were either absent or compromised. The political culture that allowed this to continue was not unique to Springfield. It is a recognizable American phenomenon. The political economy of a declining city, where the remaining power structures are organized around the distribution of a shrinking resource base rather than the expansion of a growing one. Contracts went to connected vendors. Patronage employment cushioned the political class from the consequences that the working class absorbed directly. The city's credit rating deteriorated to the point where rating agencies declined to assign Springfield even a junk bond classification, on the grounds that the financial data the city produced was too unreliable to rate at all. Not rated below investment grade. Not rated. The numbers were not trustworthy enough to evaluate. By the late 1990s, the accumulated damage was becoming visible even to observers who had been inclined to look away. Investigative reports in the local press documented the gap between the city's official financial position and its actual one. State officials began asking questions. The questions accelerated after a new mayoral administration took office and began opening the books with something approaching full transparency for the first time in years. What they found was not a gap. It was a chasm. In 2004, a state audit revealed that Springfield's true cumulative deficit was $41 million, more than double the $20 million figure the city had officially declared. The actual shortfall had been obscured for years through accounting practices that ranged from optimistic to fraudulent. The city could not service its existing debt. It could not meet its payroll obligations reliably. It could not, without intervention, continue to function as a municipal government in any meaningful sense. Massachusetts had a decision to make. It did not take long to make it. The state issued Springfield a $52 million emergency loan and established a finance control board, a 5-member panel appointed by the governor, with authority that superseded the elected city government on all financial matters. The board took control in 2004. It cut city employment. It renegotiated contracts. It imposed austerity across every department, with the particular cruelty that austerity always carries. The cuts fell hardest on the services that the poorest residents depended on most, because those services had the least political protection and the most expendable budgets. The schools absorbed cuts. The libraries absorbed cuts. The parks absorbed cuts. The people who needed those things most had the least power to protect them. The board dissolved itself in 2009, the U.S. men now im Tuus, leaving behind $48 million in a stabilization trust fund and a city that had been made technically solvent through means that had made daily life measurably harder for its most vulnerable residents. The structural conditions that had produced the deficit, the shrunken tax base, the concentrated poverty, the absence of a major employer capable of anchoring the local economy the way the Armory once had, remained entirely in place. The books balanced. The problem did not go away. The problem, in a very real sense, had never been the books. Springfield's population in 2000 stood at 152,082. The median household income was $30,417, roughly half the state average. The poverty rate was 28.4%. The Armory buildings on the hill had been designated a National Historic Site in 1974 and converted into a museum, open to the public, free of charge, housing the world's largest collection of American military firearms in the long brick workshops where those firearms had once been manufactured. The museum was well maintained. It attracted visitors. It did not employ 3,500 people. Chapter 5. New Blows. The Finance Control Board left Springfield in 2009 with its books technically balanced and its structural problems intact. The city that emerged from 5 years of state oversight was leaner in the ways that austerity makes things lean. Fewer employees, renegotiated contracts, reduced services, and no stronger in the ways that actually matter. The manufacturing base was not coming back. The tax base was not expanding. The poverty rate had not moved in any meaningful direction. What the board had accomplished was the financial equivalent of stopping a hemorrhage without treating the wound. Springfield was stable. It was not recovered. There is a difference. The recovery, such as it was, had barely begun when the sky opened. On the afternoon of June 1, 2011, a series of tornadoes touched down across western Massachusetts, the strongest of them, an EF3 with winds estimated at 160 miles per hour, cut a path directly through Springfield, entering the city from the south and traveling northeast for roughly 39 miles before dissipating. It was on the ground in Springfield for less than 10 minutes. In that time, it destroyed or severely damaged hundreds of homes, 2 public schools, a community center, and a stretch of the South End neighborhood that had already been among the city's most economically vulnerable. The damage assessment came in at $106 million. The federal disaster declaration that followed released relief funds, and the state contributed additional resources, and the cleanup began. But some neighborhoods never fully recovered. The lots where houses had stood remained empty for years. In certain blocks of the South End, they are empty still. The tornado was the kind of blow that a healthy city absorbs and rebuilds from, and a struggling city absorbs and cannot fully recover from. Springfield was a struggling city. The relief money repaired what it could reach and left the rest to the slow mathematics of insurance settlements, contractor availability, and the personal financial circumstances of residents who had, in many cases, been living one emergency away from instability before the wind arrived. The recovery was uneven, in the way that recoveries in poor cities always are, visible in the places where resources concentrated, invisible in the places where they did not. 10 years later, you could still tell where the tornado had been. 3 years after the tornado, the Massachusetts Gaming Commission awarded one of the state's 3 newly authorized resort casino licenses to MGM Resorts International for a site in downtown Springfield. The project was announced as a catalyst. $573 million in private investment, 3,000 construction jobs, 3,000 permanent positions once the facility opened. A destination that would bring visitors to a downtown that had been losing them for decades. MGM Springfield opened on August 24, 2018, occupying a full city block between Main Street and Columbus Avenue. Its design incorporating the facades of several historic buildings that had been retained as a gesture toward the architectural continuity of a streetscape that the development had otherwise substantially altered. The casino was, by the metrics available to measure such things, a success. It generated tax revenue for the city, roughly $25 million annually in its early years of operation. It employed people. It brought visitors downtown who spent money in the surrounding restaurants and hotels. By the standards of what a single private development can accomplish in a mid-sized post-industrial city, it performed reasonably well. But a casino is not a factory. It does not build supplier networks. It does not train workers in transferable skills. It does not anchor a secondary ecosystem of smaller businesses the way a major manufacturer does. The $573 million that MGM invested in Springfield created jobs that paid service industry wages in a city where the gap between service industry wages and a stable working-class life had been widening for 40 years. The math was not straightforward. The math was, in fact, the same math it had always been. A city reaching for the available instrument rather than the necessary one, because the necessary one was no longer available. It had not been available for a long time. Downtown Springfield in 2018 was a complicated place to read. The casino occupied its block with the confident architecture of a building that expects to be there for a long time. A few blocks north, the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame, a gleaming structure on the riverfront, rebuilt and expanded in 2002, drew visitors from across the country, its bronze plaques and rotating exhibits testifying to the global reach of something invented in a gymnasium 12 blocks away in 1891. On Chestnut Street, the Amazing World of Dr. Seuss Museum had opened in 2017, its exterior decorated with sculpted characters from the books, its interior designed for the children who had grown up with them. The Springfield Armory National Historic Site received roughly 50,000 visitors a year. Its museum galleries housed in the same long brick buildings where Thomas Blanchard's lathe had run in 1819. The city had become in certain respects a very well-organized museum of its own past. The things Springfield had given the world, basketball, the American automobile, mass production, the dictionary of its language, the books that had taught several generations of American children to read, were preserved and exhibited and celebrated with genuine care. Tour buses came. School groups came. The history was real. And the pride in it was real. None of it changed the poverty rate. None of it raised the median household income. None of it rebuilt the manufacturing base that the Armory's closure had begun to dismantle in 1968. Pride in the past is not a substitute for the conditions that produced it. There is a particular kind of civic melancholy that attaches to a city that has become a museum of its own achievements. It is not self-pity exactly. It is something closer to the feeling of standing in a room full of photographs of people you loved, in a house they no longer live in. The photographs are real. The people in them were real. The house is still standing. But the thing that made it what it was, the noise, the movement, the particular energy of a place that is making something rather than remembering something, that is gone. And the photographs, however carefully preserved, cannot restore it. Chapter 6. The inventory of what remains. Springfield, Massachusetts has a population today of approximately 154,700 people. That number places it 174th among American cities. Down from 72nd in 1960, a descent of 102 positions in the national ranking over 6 decades. The poverty rate stands at 25.8%. The child poverty rate stands at 39.3%. The median household income is $52,656, roughly $40,000 below the Massachusetts state average. These are not abstractions. They are the daily arithmetic of a city. The difference between a child who eats breakfast before school and one who does not. Between a family that can absorb an unexpected car repair and one that cannot. Between a neighborhood that maintains its housing stock and one that does not. The numbers are specific because the lives behind them are specific. The Connecticut River still runs along the western edge of the city, wide and unhurried. The same river that William Pynchon crossed in 1636, because the geometry of the crossing was too valuable to ignore. The river has been cleaned considerably since the industrial era. The paper mills and dye works that once discharged into it are gone, and the water quality has improved enough that certain fish species have returned. The riverfront has been landscaped into a park. On summer evenings, people walk along it. The view across the water to West Springfield is unobstructed and in certain light, genuinely beautiful. There are no factories on the bank anymore. There is nothing on the bank anymore except the river and the path and the people walking. The river does not know what it lost. The Springfield Armory National Historic Site occupies the same ridge above the city that George Washington selected in 1777. The main Arsenal Building, a long, severe Federal-style structure of red brick built in 1847, houses the museum's primary collection, including what the National Park Service describes as the world's largest collection of American military firearms. The collection runs from flintlock Muscale muskets, manufactured on the premises in the 1790s, to modern infantry weapons, arranged chronologically along the walls of a room that smells of gun oil and old wood, and the particular stillness of a space that was built for noise and is now quiet. The lathes that Thomas Blanchard conceived in 1819 and installed at the Armory in 1822. The machine that implied interchangeable parts, that implied the assembly line, that implied the entire architecture of modern manufacturing, is in the collection. It sits behind glass. It does not run. 2 blocks from the Armory site, the Springfield College Gymnasium, where James Naismith nailed his peach baskets to the running track rail in December of 1891, is still in use. The college has placed a marker at the spot where the baskets hung. The gym floor has been refinished many times. The building itself, Alumni Hall, a Victorian structure of brick and stone, looks exactly like a place where something important happened, and exactly like a place that does not know how to be anything other than what it is. The Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame stands on the riverfront a mile to the south, its curved glass facade visible from the highway. In 2024, it inducted its latest class. The ceremony was held, as it always is, in Springfield. The game Naismith invented in 2 weeks is now a $10 billion industry. He died in 1939 with less than $1,000 to his name. The Merriam-Webster offices remain in Springfield, on Federal Street, in a building that has been renovated and expanded several times since George and Charles Merriam opened their print shop nearby in 1831. The dictionary is updated continuously now, new words added each year as the language generates them, words from technology, from immigration, from the particular creativity of a living language that does not ask permission before it changes. The editors who decide which words enter the dictionary and which do not work in Springfield, Massachusetts, in a mid-sized office building in a mid-sized city, performing one of the stranger acts of institutional authority in American cultural life. They have been doing it, in one form or another, for nearly 2 centuries. Smith & Wesson, now rebranded as American Outdoor Brands and subsequently split into separate entities, maintained manufacturing operations in Springfield until 2020, when the company relocated its headquarters to Maryville, Tennessee, citing the regulatory and tax environment of Massachusetts. The factory buildings on Stockbridge Street, where Horace Smith and Daniel Wesson began production in 1856, were left behind. Some have been converted to other uses. Some have not. The name Smith & Wesson still exists, still manufactures firearms, still sells revolvers that trace their mechanical lineage back to the Model 1 of 1857. The company is no longer in Springfield. It has not been for several years now. It joins a long list. The Indian Motorcycle Company. The first successful American motorcycle manufacturer, founded in Springfield in 1901, closed its original operations in 1953. The brand was revived, sold, revived again, sold again, passing through several ownership structures over the following decades, with the particular trajectory of an American brand whose name is worth more than its operations. Indian motorcycles are manufactured today in Spirit Lake, Iowa. The original factory site on State Street in Springfield has been redeveloped. There is a historical marker. The Rolls-Royce factory that operated in Springfield from the early 1920s is gone. The workshop on Taylor Street where Frank Duryea drove the first American gasoline automobile in September of 1893 is gone. The building where Theodore Geisel was born on Howard Street in 1904 still stands. A wood frame house in a residential neighborhood, privately owned, not open to the public, bearing a small plaque that notes what happened there. The Cat in the Hat is still in print. It has been continuously in print since 1957. The house has no visitors center, no gift shop, no guided tours. It is just a house. A family lives there now. The MGM Springfield Casino occupies its block on Main Street with the self-contained completeness of a building designed to be its own destination. Its own restaurants, its own entertainment spaces, its own logic of arrival and departure that does not require the surrounding city to be anything in particular. On a Friday evening, the parking garage fills. The floors inside are lit with the particular quality of light that casinos use, bright and directionless, the kind of light that makes it difficult to know what time it is. Outside on Main Street, the evening is quieter than it would have been in 1950 or 1920 or 1890. The street is not empty. It is not what it was. The Armory buildings are still on the hill. The brick is the same brick, dark red, late in the 1840s, weathered to the particular color that New England brick achieves after a century and a half of winters. In the late afternoon, when the sun comes from the west, the long facade of the main arsenal catches the light and holds it for a moment before the shadow of the ridge moves across it. The windows are intact. The roof is maintained. Inside, behind the glass, the Blanchard lathe sits in the position it was placed when the museum opened, in a room that was built to manufacture the tools of war and now manufactures nothing at all. The machines are still. The river still runs. The city is still here.